Good afternoon, and welcome to the Wilson Library Research Forum. My name is Matt Turry, and I'll be hosting today. And this is a very small part of my job, but it's the part of my job that I find most enjoyable. It's working with the fellows that come here, and I always really love it when they come back and they tell us what they found. And that really is the essential reason why we're gathered here today. So much deep knowledge about our collections and the potentials that lie in in our collections walks out of the reading room every day, and we rarely see it unless we start looking for bibliographies and other research materials. So this is a quick, informal way for us to get a grasp on the scholarship that's emerging. The structure is similar to the last one. We're going to have two speakers today. They'll each speak for 20 minutes in a sequence, and then we'll have time for questions for about 15 or 20 minutes at the end. We'd ask you to put those questions into the chat box as they occur to you. We'll read them when we sort of gather back together to chat. And of course, if you want to raise your hand, you can raise your hand and we'll do our best to call on you and you can ask your question, probably in a more nuanced way than you might put in a chat box. I'd like to thank a number of people. One thing is I get to work with the fellows and my name gets to be on emails, but the reason that the fellowship program works so very well is that everybody in Wilson Library pulls together to make their visits here a success. And we really couldn't do it without the 50 some odd people who scramble to find resources for the fellows when they're here. I'd also like to thank Nadia Clifton, who's basically making this possible. We were having technical difficulties before, and if we had to rely on me, this still wouldn't be happening. And of course, my communications colleagues who put out announcements, and that's why you're all here. So, on to the speakers. The first speaker today is R. Volney Reiser, who goes by Rob Reiser. He's going to be presenting on a topic that he calls Living Disfranchisement. He was the recipient of a visiting research fellowship, and that's a fellowship that we have here that supports essentially 2 weeks of dedicated research use. And it was funded by the Joel Williamson Fund for the Southern Historical Collection. And its essential goal is to fund and support research about African-American life, culture, and history in the South. A short bio. Rob is a professor of history at the University of West Alabama, where he teaches a broad range of U.S. history courses. From 2008 to 2014, he was an academic administrator, and from 2012 to 2017, he served as editor of the Alabama Review. As a researcher, he specializes in U.S. constitutional history, American political history, and the history of the American South. His recent publications include Defying Disfranchisement, Black Voting Rights Activism in the Jim Crow South, 1890 to 1908, that was published by LSU in 2010. And he's now finishing two new monographs on the disfranchisement era, Politics, Anti-Democracy, and Jim Crow Constitutionalism, 1890 to 1915. And he's also working on a legal biography of Booker T. Washington that is going to be entitled The Litigious Mr. Washington. Our second speaker is Rebekah Aycock, and she was a recipient of a Southern Studies Pre-Dissertation Prospectus Fellowship, which is funded by the Watson Brown Foundation. Her presentation title is Upside Down and Inside Out, White Fear and Radical Potentialities in the Plantation Household. Rebekah is a PhD candidate in the Department of American Studies at the University of Kansas, and her dissertation explores burglary in U.S. culture, looking at real and fictional home burglary cases, primarily in the second half of the 19th century. She looks at the different elements of the crime in order to understand how it became a racialized and sexualized felony. More broadly, she considers how ideas about this crime can inform our understanding of how white fear functions as an effective force that perpetuates white supremacy and how white people's emotional satisfaction became the expectation for modern conceptions of peace and justice. So that's introduction. Forgive me for reading, but I wanted to get a lot in quickly and I ramble. So we're going to go to Rob now, who will give his talk for 20 minutes. Again, put your questions into the chat feature, and then we'll go on to Rebekah's talk, and we'll see you at the end.
Hey guys, so am I heard?
You are.
Can you hear me? Okay, excellent. So, and Matt, I remembered the announcement. So Matt and Nadia and Rebekah already know this. There's a train in my backyard, and chances are very good that sometime in the next 20 minutes, a train is going to visit us, and I will hear the crossing signal at the end of my street before it happens. So if it happens, I will tell everyone train, and it's not a drinking game, or it can be if you want, but it'll be okay. The train usually passes fairly quickly. So when I started about a month ago trying to put together my thoughts for this talk, I'll admit I had a lot of trouble doing it. One, it's been well nigh 3-4 years since I gave a research talk, so I'm a little rusty. And the other thing is that from the time that I first applied for this, and Matt, I think I was supposed to have been there in the summer of 20. So I would have been there's the application and the project description from the spring of 2020. And then there's, what it looks like now exactly 2 years later. And we all know how these things sort of change and evolve over time. And to skip ahead to the takeaway here, I can tell you that my 3 weeks there in the reading room with Rebekah, I found a lot of fun and exciting new things that have definitely shaped how the project will unfold as I hope to, before I die, finish this thing. Mainly because, and it's just a reflection of the remarkable depth of your collections there at Wilson Library. And you all know how deep your collection is. I think what I'll do is just tell you generally what I'm doing and why and how it came to be. And then I'll walk you through where the project stands now and how what I came across and read there at the collection over this past summer, how it will affect the future course of the project. So I am not afraid to tell people how old I am. I'm 48 years old. And that matters to sort of explain. Well, the truth is I have been working on this project. I did the math the other day for, I think, 21 years and 4 months. So this project, it dates back to the fall of 1997 when I was a student in a U.S. History Survey course at Florida State with Maxine Jones, if anybody knows Maxine. And, I'm probably one of 10,000 kids who heard their professor talk about the rise of Jim Crow and disfranchisement, and who raised their hand, or in my case, went up to the professor after class and said, how on earth did they get away with this? And in my case, Maxine knew that I was planning to go to graduate school. So she wasn't dismissing me with this reply, but what she just sort of laughs at me and says, well, you're the one going to graduate school. Why don't you go to the library and see what you can find out? And I go to the library that day, and literally the first book I took off the shelf was Woodward's Origins of the New South. Again, like 10,000 other students, you start with something Woodward says. And I was struck, in Woodward's case, it's a chapter he calls The Mississippi Plan is the American Way. And reading that chapter, I'm scanning the footnotes, and this leads me to his evidence for the statement, and the quote from Woodward is, the writing of white man's law for Asiatic and Afro-American proceeded simultaneously. And that sentence, that launched the whole thing. What I initially was doing at that point as a prospective graduate student, and then when I got to graduate school and was writing a master's thesis, my original research was into a Senate committee called the Hawaiian Commission, sometimes also called the Cullum Committee. And this is after annexation in the summer of 1898. There's a committee is appointed by, but actually, I'm not sure if President McKinley appointed the committee or if the Senate, President Pro Tem appointed the committee, but it's primarily senators, and they come back and they issue a report. That Hawaiian Commission document, as it turns out, in North Carolina in 1899, in Alabama in 1899, and then 1901 in Virginia in 1901. And subsequently, that commission report constantly came up in any public discussion of disfranchisement. Or to get back to my original question, will we, to paraphrase the disfranchisers from the time, will we get away with this? Right? So I say that by way of explaining why there's a map of Maui over my head. I don't know if any of you recognize what that is. And I will tell you that what I have now, after all these years of winding around from project to project, is in essence, I've come back after all these years to that first question that I put to my undergraduate professor. What my project will be And the title changes once or twice a day. So as I made the joke before we came live, it's the Disfranchisement Project. But what it ultimately is about, it's about the atmosphere that surrounds the disfranchisement movement. I am not interested necessarily in, which faction of Southern Democrats or which faction of white supremacists first hatched the plan. To use the old phrases, was it a Bourbon coup d'etat? Was it a revolt of the rednecks? Those things are very interesting and they're very important, but they're not what I'm doing. What I want to look at are broader questions, broader constitutional questions or constitutionalisms that surrounded the movement. And it's not so much a question anymore. It is, but it's the elaborate exercises that disfranchisers put themselves through to convince both themselves and a wary white voting public, to convince everyone that they could get away with this thing, that it was possible, etc. There are a few broad categories that these constitutional debates always they always veer off onto certain paths. And this is true beginning in Mississippi in 1890. If you want to talk about the first of the official disfranchising conventions, it's true to a limited extent in public discussions in Tennessee, when Tennessee first introduces its infamous Lee, Dorch, and Myers bills a couple years before the Mississippi Convention. But versions of these questions keep coming up from time to time. And the questions are, what does the Republican Party think about this? What does the Northern voting public think about this? What does the Supreme Court think about this? They will then, as the 1890s, as the decade comes to a close, they will introduce questions of empire and territorial expansion, right? But it's always, how does this affect the potential success of these disfranchising instruments that we're discussing? When I was a graduate student all those many years ago and started out writing about this government body called the Hawaiian Commission, I got away from that pretty quickly. I didn't abandon it. It clearly, though, to me, it worked better as a set of sort of topical analysis, topical tools of topical analysis. And what I ended up doing as a master's student and then as a doctoral student, I produced research using the Alabama's 1901 convention as the laboratory, which is what Woodward had used in his original telling of the Mississippi Plan as the American Way. And I had it set entirely in Alabama, entirely inside the Constitutional Convention, which is a very traditional, very old-fashioned, and honestly kind of boring way to do it. And as my research drew to a close, I started casting about for not purely social history, but I was trying to find a broader range of political voices. And so I do another very old-fashioned thing is I start reading county level newspapers from across the state of Alabama. And this is how old I am. I was doing these on microfilm, at the state archives and in county courthouses and in, cramped little interlibrary loan rooms at the university library. So I didn't even have the benefit of these wonderful search engines that we all now have. And what I started to find I found more voices, but the voices are always talking about the same things. And so I knew that I had a good set of base questions. But by the time I had finished, I had discovered a whole other world of disfranchisement. And that is the world of African Americans who are living through it and who are plotting to combat it at the time that it's taking place. And what that became, it eventually, after I've graduated and after I'm working and holding down a tenure track job, I split that off of the main project. And that became, in 2010, the book Defying Disfranchisement. Those activists, they needed to be treated separately. Trying to do all of this in one project, it was just huge and unwieldy. And so I put the research away until 2017, when, as Matt said, 2017 was was when I finished my tenure as a journal editor. And so I was free to return back to the work. When I returned back to that original disfranchisement project, this is the place to tell this story. There's an experience probably 2-3 years before I finished graduate school. We had a visiting scholar came to the department, and I will not identify said scholar. Scholar is having lunch with a few of the dissertation writers, and there's probably 3 or 4 of us in the room. And we're asked to go around the table, tell us what you're working on. And when it came to my turn, I tell them I'm doing this project about the disfranchised. Here comes a train. I'm doing a project about the disfranchisement movement in Alabama. Yada, 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 yada. And I describe it, and they look at me and they go, wow, that sounds really exciting, but the Chapel Hill Mafia will never stand for this, right? Now, what they meant, let's the train go by. This one's not too bad. What they were referring to with the quip about the Chapel Hill Mafia is obviously there is not a mafia in Chapel Hill, unless Matt says there is, and they're going to come out and put a hit on me. But what they were referring was, no one wants to read a book, or really, honestly, how many people want to read a dissertation that is simply about the state of Alabama? Right? It's not fashionable, number one, and number two, it's how useful is it to simply keep this, confined to a single state. Now, on the one hand, you can't really go into super detail of every state if you're doing a project that involves every state. But at the same time, again, it can be a little boring just to read about one group of guys in a convention hall in Montgomery. So with that in mind, I decided to broaden my study. And I'm less curious now about, even though I'm still addressing what happens inside the convention halls across the South, and even though Alabama may still be a starting point, I want a broader range of voices. I want to hear from a broader community, both in the state of Alabama and then from around the South. And I want to know what it was to actually live this. A sentence I find myself repeating to my students all the time coming out of high school is, and coming out of high school, they tend to want to resolve every problem. So every historical question is a problem to be answered. And I find them, they find incongruities, and they want to come up with a consensus answer to everything. And so I'm always having to push them to let history happen. And so that's what I'm doing here. I'm looking at the time and I'm just chattering on. What really struck me in my time there in the collection, and I'm going to pop up I'm going to share document. I don't think I shared that properly. I want you to see this. So here's hold on. Sorry, guys. I was just going to show you a map of, can you see what's on the screen? Could people see that? No?
No.
No.
Okay, we're going to pretend what you're looking at is a Word document that has a list of collections there that I looked at. I looked at 63 collections in all during my 3 weeks there at the Wilson Library, and I collected material from 50. What I was really surprised by when I was there is I knew I was going to find a lot of collections from a lot of states. I did not expect to find the intimate level detail that I found. And I went back through all of sort of the greatest hits, the collections that you would find cited in any study of disfranchisement in the South, or of just say disfranchisement in North Carolina, or you could be more specific and say, the Wilmington riots in North Carolina. I was surprised at how much more material I found about all of those episodes than I had seen previously described, or that I had previously seen cited in other collections. Some of this is a function of, I think, you can only address so much material and so many documents in a single study, right? So it's everybody makes choices. I think in some cases it's because collections are newly arrived there. I want to draw everyone's attention to the T.H. Hicks and Bell Purvis collection. I've only ever had a chance to recommend it to one other scholar. I can't recommend it highly enough. It's not huge, and in terms of diaries, it's sort of strange. The diarist, he essentially at one point starts producing like one diary entry per year, sort of in his law ledger books. But I found it to be an extraordinary document. It was extraordinary for me as a political historian, the family level detail, right? The detail he gives of a family that is ripped apart by North Carolina's white supremacy campaign. It's also a remarkable document in terms of relations between a husband and a wife. The way he speaks of his wife is just, it's remarkable, the degree of intimacy that is expressed there. I was rather astonished too by what I was able to find on the Connor family. This is Robert Connor and his father, also, who I think was also Robert, who chaired North Carolina, who was the Speaker of the House for the 1899 North Carolina legislative session. I think one of the reasons that I am able to tell you that I found a great deal more material than I thought I ever would find is because in these collections, especially the ones, sort of the more prominent, famous ones that in the early 20th century, academics would have been looking to produce the first histories of disfranchisement and Jim Crow, it's just a function of the world they lived in. They didn't pay attention to any of the correspondence that's not directly from the male principal to other male principals. And as a result, there are, in the case of the Connor papers, you have an extensive correspondence between, say, teenage and college-age children and their mother, where they're talking about their father's political activities, or sometimes there's correspondence between a husband and a wife. And I know that those early 20th century scholars, in some cases, I think they were just simply ignoring what the other members of the family had to say. And this was true for a broad range of the North Carolina collections that I looked at. I think in some cases also, there may have been usage restrictions still in place, because at the time that the first histories of disfranchisement are being written, these collections, these people are still alive. And so that very well could contribute in some cases. It may be that I simply have access to more of the material than prior scholars would have had. I looked at collections. North Carolina was the state I spent the most time on for obvious reasons. It's going to be the most heavily represented for this period. But I found important, useful material from, I think, at least 7 states, as well as Hawaii, and I don't want to talk about Hawaii today. I realize that when I mention Hawaii in the context of a big project on disfranchisement, it has the effect of like a needle drop, and I'm aware of that, but it can get us a little too much into the tall weeds. But let me just say that the through line of the entire project is something to have to do with Hawaii. And it sort of blew me away that I was in the Wilson Library doing research on Southern history, looking at an important manuscript collection that has to do with a very important episode in territorial Hawaiian history. So that was sort of a surprise. Matt, how am I on time? I have made it through the first page of my little list of notes of things I wanted to tell you about.
I think a few more minutes, Rob, then we would have to go to Rebekah.
You can shut me up, and maybe if someone has a question maybe about what I've already said, they can ask me Q&A. I don't want to step on Rebekah's toe.
Okay, let's go to Rebekah, and then we'll see the time that we have at the end.
Yeah.
All right, I just want to briefly recap. So our second speaker today is Rebekah Aycock, and she'll be talking about the title of her presentation is Upside Down and Inside Out: White Fear and Radical Potentialities in the Plantation Household. Welcome, Rebekah.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Actually, I might be going a little under the allotted time, so this works out totally fine. Um, I am going to share a PowerPoint, which I think will be helpful and have the added benefit of not having my face huge on your screens, which I prefer. Okay, can everyone see just the presentation? Okay, great. So I'm presenting today on white fear and radical potentialities. This is the first chapter of my dissertation. It represents most of what I was looking at last summer. Like Rob said, we ended up being a year after we expected in the library, which was fine. But when I applied to the program, I expressed a very general interest in the idea of the home and American identity and white fear and projection of fears after emancipation. But by the time I was in the library, I had finished my coursework and passed my exams, and I had a much clearer dissertation topic, which worked out just fine. So I'm going to start with a quick introduction to what I'm studying in my dissertation overall, and then go into some things I found while I was at the library. Okay, so like Matt said, my dissertation research is on burglary in US culture. I'm specifically interested in the burglary narrative as it's coming up in real and fictional accounts of crime in the second half of the 19th century. My interest in this actually came out of a UNC Press book. I read early in my grad career Seth Koch's study of the death penalty in North Carolina, and he mentions pretty briefly how burglary was a capital crime until 1941 because of its sexual undertones, a capital crime in some states until that time. And I found that very interesting, of course. And I went looking for more about it and was disappointed when I didn't find anything. But that was until I looked into more traditional legal study sources, which was when I found a lot of confused, critical legal studies scholars saying, this has lost all meaning. This crime doesn't describe any particular act anymore. And it never really seems to have done so. To illustrate some of this messiness, though, I've added a little graph here of burglary at common law, which then would go to influence the penal codes in colonial and then early America. So it's this crime that occurs at night. There's an entry made possible by a break into the dwelling of another, so it can't be your own house. And then with, most importantly, the intent to commit a crime, usually a specific list of felonies. So you'll see that the elements, a lot of the elements are not criminal acts as much as conditions and circumstances. So up to this day, attaching burglary to an offense can be used to increase a punishment for a crime based on often personal perceptions and associations, not an evaluation of any additional action or even attempted action. And that's why contemporary legal scholars are saying this is an empty or a thin crime because it doesn't really describe a distinct offense. I obviously disagree. I think burglary is very heavy. It's very culturally loaded. It brings together topics and values that come up a lot and come up in American studies a lot that are painted sometimes as neutral or universally good, like the home and private property, the ideas of peace, keeping the peace, and also family, the nuclear family. So my research questions, yes, are why is burglary still a crime? That's my question too. But more to the point, I'm wondering why or what this attachment can teach us about historical and projected white fear. So the first thing I turned to, which is what I had originally planned to turn to at the library, were a lot of plantation records. Overwhelmingly, what I'm looking at, though, are white family correspondence within these records. And it's really interesting, too. It's so many letters from parents to their sons at college, and then they'll turn into parents to their sons as soldiers. But in these letters, what I was really looking for were glimpses of specific forms of Black people's resistance. Trespass and occupation were two big keywords for me. I'm very interested in seeing how white people were talking about them, privately, not so much anymore, but they're horrified at what they're seeing happening at this time period. They're getting, I think, a glimpse of the world as they know it falling apart, and taking note of ways that they'll have to rein it in. One really exciting example I found was in the Elliott and Gonzalez family papers. And I wish I had pictures. I worked really hard to try to find something visual, but everything I looked at is just tan paper. That's it. That's all I got. But this was really cool because I looked in the finding aid and saw that it was a case of occupation. And I expected it to be men. I expected it to be like a violent uprising and occupation, but that's not at all what I found. What I found is this letter from a son to his mother. He has heard a report from his cousin. They're both Confederate soldiers. And has checked on the house. He's checked on their plantation when he was in town, and has come across these Black women from down the street at the Grove plantation. They've occupied the house. And I'll read this quote here. On going into my house, he found Chloe, the cousin found Chloe, Stephen's wife, seated at Phoebe's piano, playing away like the very devil, and two damsels upstairs dancing away famously. All of them were from the Grove. This was at midday on Friday. The house was completely turned upside down and inside out. The Grove house has also been depredated upon and nearly everything stolen. The Negroes are not doing any work upon the plantations, and the fields white with cotton. So then the letter goes on to describe more of the homes in the area and the state of the church in the area. And I guess this is interesting in its own right, but I'm also specifically interested in how they're describing these moments as offensive, as examples of violence, of theft and violation. It's also an example, I think, of rejecting the level of affective policing that is part of what I think helps white supremacy thrive. And this is a question that they're, I guess, asking right now is, there's no for sure that emancipation was coming at this point, but they're questioning what freedom looks like, what it might look like. And it's threatening to them, but we can read it today as really fantastic moments of claim and reclaiming. There was also a letter in the Springs family papers. This is a scan. It's not much better than the original photo, but that's all right. This is a letter between two friends talking about how someone in the community has caught his wife with one of the men he enslaved. And then I'll read part of this. It says, on the night of the 14th, being dark and rainy, someone, I haven't been able to read the name, I need to ask about that. Someone, this so kept secret from Negroes, gave Boyd notice that the red buck Plent was with Jane in her house. Boyd made for Patton's. He and Patton came to the house, Patton at the front door, Boyd at the back. The former ordered Jane to get up and make a light. And then the rest of the letter is this really violent hunt for Plent. described in great detail, and it's really horrifying. But my interest here is not just the threat, supposed threat to the purity of mythic white womanhood, or even the fact of this, consensual interracial relationship, possibly, but also in this, the nature of the document being a letter between contemporaries, and then this note, this so kept secret from Negroes. There's an anxiety here, I'm reading, of losing discursive authority, losing control of, painting the picture of what's going on behind closed doors in these homes. There are more examples from last summer. A lot of them are more brutal than I'd like to share in this format. Haven't really decided how I'm going to work with things yet. But I'm very interested in these scenes and the way that they're written about. They represent to me a real loss of control, kind of a mockery of, the absoluteness or naturalness of that level of control, not just over bodies, but also people's expressions of emotion and behavior, and a real requirement for deference, and also, and we'll go on to see this during Jim Crow, of course, this justification of really horrible violence based on perceived or invented slights. So with I'm studying a crime that looks at or evaluates criminal intention. So this is very relevant to me. So per one of many of Matt's recommendations, but he recommended I look at some papers from judges and lawyers, which is probably what I spent the next most amount of time on. Lots of case notes, trial records, correspondence between judges and lawyers, between lawyers and their clients and each other. All of that was very helpful to me in understanding Burley's definition, but also how it was legally applied in practice. So 2 examples I'll raise from this category are the Moore and Gatlin law firm papers, which are great, and then also the Mallard papers, the Raymond Mallard papers, which is out of my time period mostly, but he put together this incredible 1,200-page judicial reference book that has these definitions of crimes and elements, and it was really helpful to pilfer through, and thankfully was alphabetized. So here's an example of some of that. And this guy, he was a lawyer and a judge in North Carolina. So here is an example of his draft of the burglary entry. He is looking at not just the definition, but he's also listing all of this case precedent, which is really helpful for me to have compiled in this one spot. But I also looked at some of his case briefs and correspondence. Also in that same reference book were descriptions of the elements. And I wanted to mention this, it's hard to figure out where to fit it in. But before I went to the SHC, I had found just through online research, these definitions of nighttime, the element of nighttime. And I looked at colonial law and early American law that's describing nighttime, is defining nighttime by whether it's light enough to discern a man's face or something similar to that language. But it wasn't until I read in the Mallard papers, his commentary on nighttime, that I knew that this definition of nighttime was still being circulated and referenced, at least I know now, until the mid-20th century. So here's his note on the definition that he's pulling from early American law. It says, if there be daylight enough begun or left to discern a man's face withal, it is no burglary. In the law of burglary, there must not be daylight enough to discern a man's face. So this is very interesting to me. It's practically useful, but also definitions of burglary and a lot of the justification for keeping burglary as a crime, they talk about a special fear, a special terror. That sort of language comes up a lot. There's enough of something there that helps define the crime, that helps make it somehow justifiable to be a crime, even though it describes technically very little. And I don't know yet exactly, but I am thinking that this definition of nighttime is a key to understanding that better. So most of what I found was in the SHC, but there was a little bit of time to look at some other collections I was led to while I was there, which I really appreciated. The first is in the rare book collection. There were a couple of publishers' papers. The A.B. Watts papers and August Thomas papers are the examples here. So I was able to not read through the stories. These were just publishers' documentation of whether something was accepted or rejected. So I was able to glean some titles and authors' names, mostly of newspaper serials, but also this really dramatic play that I wouldn't have known about otherwise. And also in the Southern Folklife collection, the people there, I don't know who it was, but they were nice enough to put together audio files I could listen to of this folk song Burglar Man. And it's really interesting to see how the renditions of this song change over time. And I won't play it because it's really obnoxious and sexist. And I'm not going to do that to you, but it was very helpful. And I think that's all I have, except thanks for rescheduling this and not canceling it, which happened to a lot of my peers for things like this. It was really helpful. I enjoyed being there, and Taylor and Matt were very helpful to all of us. And yeah, I'm glad to answer any questions.
Well, thank you for that. If people have questions, if you want to begin putting those into the chat box, that would be helpful. I was going to ask about a particular source that we discussed that I wondered if it had ended up being helpful to you, was the corpus of laws that had been gathered by my colleague Sarah Carrier and others on Jim Crow era laws. Did that end up working out as a good source for you?
Yes. Are you talking about that the project with all the
on the
yes.
books? Yeah.
Yeah, it was incredible. I was able to put together this really anal retentive Excel spreadsheet of a bunch of different laws from that. So it was really helpful. I just wish that it existed for every state in the nation, but that's okay.
My understanding is it's expanding somewhat, but that would be an interesting goal.
Cool.
Rebekah, and to everyone, I just posted a link up there to the case law project. And so for Rebekah, have you encountered this yet, the case law project? No? Okay, good news. So, and I have recently been able to do something cool with it. So it's Harvard runs it, and it's going to let you do a full text search of state Supreme Court decisions from others. And so it's one of those things where, I mean, it's going to give you more than you want, but that can be a good thing. And because this is in a day and age before you're going to have, say, published rules of evidence at the state level, and you will be able to track rather than sit down with every volume of the state Supreme Court reporter. You can track the state Supreme Courts in a particular state's changing definition of just burglary as they work through these common law concepts. And it would pair beautifully with that, for example, that commonplace book that you showed us, where the lawyer was maintaining a commonplace book of the law of burglary. And so you can track that alongside because that's where he's getting it. He could be getting it from a courtroom where he's attended court, or he could be getting it from a published an opinion of the state Supreme Court. So the case law project can be, it's not the fanciest search engine, but it's also free. And so you'll be able to pull up every burglary case before, say, the North Carolina Supreme Court. And that's surely going to give you more cases than you would hope in a first hit. But you can then start refining it and see how the language and the concept develops over time.
Thank you, Rob. You're making the case. One of the things that works so well in this fellowship program is when we can all get together and talk and share resources. Unfortunately, the pandemic also got in the way of that sort of sociability. So thank you for bringing it up now.
I found the Word document that I had lost before. So in a second, I'll share that and the breakdown of what I was looking at and how it was organized. Yeah. Exactly.
Shatra asks an interesting question that I was thinking about as well. She has a quote, "Light enough to discern a man's face is so striking, thinking about how this would disproportionately impact Black people. Is there any data about how much more burglary is applied to Black defendants than white over time or within this time period?"
I don't have the data. I have some examples. I have things out of newspapers. I do know that what I'm looking at in my second chapter is the Negro burglary myth. Again and again, Black people, at least it came up in the newspapers, the white mainstream newspapers were called burglars, or I guess those were the allegations. And I don't know exactly the statistics compared to whites for this time period. I don't know how I would find that either, but I do know that it was a major stereotype, a racialized and a sexualized stereotype over whites.
In every, not just in the South, just in the United States, court cases.
Yes.
So if you look at these Supreme Court decisions, they aren't going to. So if you look at a case, I think most of us know this by now. So in the language, it's going to refer to a man who breaks into a house, and that's how you know it's a white man. Because if it's a case that involves an African-American defendant, they're going to identify the defendant as a Negro. And so you would be able, just from the language of the case, in many cases, even if it's not classified thus, you could probably sort of reverse engineer a pretty persuasive database of such things.
And even in terms of talking about allegations, I wonder, and I don't see John Blythe on here. He oversees a newspaper digitization program that we have. There's this really handy way that there's a frequency guide to vocabularies and the periodization that they sort of spike at. You wonder if you could create a compound search and look at the association with burglary and probably with the word Negro, given the time period of these, and maybe white, to see if you can get a sense of the degree to which those are paired in these searches. That might be interesting, more anecdotal than, but I think it would be very hard to get hard statistics like we were talking about. Rob, do you want to go ahead and share that list of collections?
I will. Let's see if we do it correctly this time. Bingo. All right. Is it? Okay, can you see it? The title of the file is a list for DeClercq. I think I gave Taylor DeClercq a copy of this, and hence the name list for DeClercq. So you see it marked. That was my last day. So when I wrapped up on my last day, this is where sort of things were frozen in time. And you see that I've classified it by state. And at the time when I made my original application, I was still largely concentrating this project in Alabama and with Alabama personalities. And because our friend Professor Hamilton was so effective, he hoovered up these really important manuscript collections from inside the state of Alabama. So these would have been my first priority, right? So and if they're colored here in Carolina blue, that means that I have completed my work in them. You even had 4 that applied to Hawaii, which was sort of a surprise. Some states, and you'll see that I had identified fewer, like Louisiana. Mississippi is a relatively small number. That's deceptive though, because as in my experience, and as I said before we started, I think anyone who's read the Agnew Diary, you find that it just becomes it's astonishing. So the fact, even though I only have a short list here of Mississippi collections, the fact that Agnew has entered the mix, that's necessarily going to sort of shift the focus. I'm at the University of North Carolina. That's where the bulk of this is going to be. And so some of these, the ones that have a famous name, like Marion Butler, well, obviously everyone and their dog has read the Marion Butler papers. I'm not sure how much, in relative terms, I'm not sure how much time people spent in Mrs. Butler's papers. Some of these collections, good example of this in terms of it's a massive collection, but it's not really a fun collection, is say the Bromberg papers. And Bromberg is an attorney and former congressman from Mobile. It is probably the dullest manuscript collection I have ever read through in my life, until found buried deep inside a rather remarkable exchange of correspondence between him and Charles Eliot, who at that time was president of Harvard. And it's Bromberg and Eliot conducting a private debate about the future of, or the legacy of Reconstruction. Sort of a remarkable, jarring thing to find hidden in it. Hidden in this collection is the Chief Justice of the Alabama Supreme Court telling his sister, before the Constitution is drafted, he's telling his sister essentially this thing is unconstitutional. Hillary Herbert is a really interesting collection, and it's not one that people have ever spent time in, but I think given sort of the current political climate surrounding history, if you want to see the politics of writing a history of disfranchisement for Jim Crow, Hillary Herbert is a fantastic place to start. Just the number of national correspondents who are dialing in. The Hawaii collection I mentioned to you that sort of startled me that it was there. It's this one, the William Stubbs papers. William Carter Stubbs, he's most famous for having run the Sugar School at Audubon Park outside of New Orleans. But for a brief period, he was sent out to Hawaii in late 1900 to conduct a labor investigation. And the Hawaii angle, what I'm working on now, is there are, out of Montgomery, Alabama and Knoxville, Tennessee, there are rather large-scale efforts to take parties to immigrate to Hawaii to work in the cane fields of Maui, hence the map of Maui above my head. And so SHC made it in. This one, again, not a huge number of collections from Louisiana. The Parker papers were remarkable because of the amount of correspondence either directly between Parker and Theodore Roosevelt, or between Parker and other friends who were trying to use Parker to get into Roosevelt's good graces. But again, North Carolina is where I spent, appropriately so, devoted the bulk of my attention when I was there with you all. And I was shocked at the end of the day to see how many of these collections I was able to work through. And not only was I shocked at how many I was able to cover in my time there, I was shocked at how many yielded interesting and useful material that in some cases I have never seen cited or discussed anywhere. So that's, as someone who's looking to publish, that's always an exciting thing to think that you might be the first one to describe a particular document. Here, these two collections at the end, this is just through the magic of alphabetical order that these two guys have ended up next to each other. And Matt, you may remember the day that this happened, and I have since sleuthed out what was going on. I was in the Francis Winston papers, and I was quite shocked to find a letter in the Winston papers from Isaiah T. Montgomery to Stephen Weeks. And it didn't make sense. Why is this letter from Montgomery to Weeks in the Winston papers? And I can now tell you that the reason that letter is in the Winston papers is because Weeks will have provided it to Winston. And Winston will have had that letter in his possession using it to help shape the Disfranchisement Amendment in North Carolina in the 1899 legislative session. That letter is written, it's Montgomery and Weeks apparently had a correspondence in, I think it's an 1893 letter. And it's Isaiah T. Montgomery is explaining disfranchisement in Mississippi in the 1890 Mississippi Constitution. He's explaining it to Weeks, who was preparing what I think we can regard as the first academic history of the disfranchisement movement. And I think he published it, in the Political Science. Weeks published it in the Political Science Journal. It's a stunning document, not simply because I was stunned to find a letter from Isaiah T. Montgomery in the Winston papers. It's shocking because it's so historically unflattering to Montgomery and his alarmingly positive spin that he's offering on disfranchisement. And I think everyone understands who Montgomery is. He is the only African-American member of Mississippi's 1890 Constitutional Convention. And then in addition to completing all of these North Carolina collections, you see I made it through a number of other collections that I just simply labeled here, other states. The two that turned out to be two of the biggest surprises for me while I was there, are on this list. It's the Tucker papers and the Watson papers. And in the case of Tucker, it's the correspondence of Henry St. George Tucker. And there's two, and there's one is a series of sort of celebrities writing him about a constitutional treatise that his late father had written. And there's also some rather interesting correspondence between him and sort of supporters of Theodore Roosevelt. And Watson, I'll just cite one sort of remarkable gem that meant a lot to me personally is, if we think in the terms of the propagation of Southern history, or let's just say the Dunning School history of historiography, the truth of it is that if you want to identify a vector, like who is the key personality in the breadth and longevity of the Dunning School, it's Hamilton. And you read through his papers and you can see that JGD Hamilton, he's essentially a vector for Dunning and other fellow Dunning students through the early 20th century. And the reason that matters here is because on the one hand, it means that Chapel Hill's history department, think of it as a Chapel Hill school, it essentially becomes the central repository for propagating and keeping these ideas of the Dunning School alive. But Chapel Hill also provides the ultimate undoing. And it's in the civil rights era, the new revisionist histories of Reconstruction and disfranchisement and Jim Crow appear. And the most important of those scholars is none other than C. Van Woodward. So I almost squealed aloud with delight the day in the Thomas Watson papers that I found the letter that has been what it is. It's the letter that Watson's daughter writes to Hamilton, asking that this graduate student, Comer Woodward, be allowed to look at her father's paper. So for me, that was in addition to the other really interesting political history that survives in the Watson papers. It was quite a thing to find Woodward in there, to make him a character in my project.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Rob. That puts us at 1 o'clock, and these hours just go so fast, unfortunately. I'd just like to invite you all to come back and visit us on April 13th. We'll be having the next of these research forums. We'll be talking about, Sierra Rourke is going to talk about the hunt for plants amongst the papers, investigating historical plant use in the American South. And Gina Kaysen will be talking about her work on erosion, a cultural history of erosion in American literature and the anxiety of disappearance. So I'd invite you to come back, and it's really been nice to see you all again. And hopefully you'll be back in the reading room, the research room before too long. Thank you all for coming. I'd like to thank you.
Just us again?
Yeah. Thank you so much. This is really a pleasure. I miss this so much, right? I mean, talking to people about what they find. And yeah, it's funny when I was looking over your list, I was happy to see ones that I was thinking